So the dust settles, right. You are looking at the complete collapse of an entire civilization.
Just total devastation.
Exactly. I mean, physical infrastructure is crumbling, the economy is entirely hollowed out,
Yeah.
the supply chains are broken, and the societal structures that held millions of people together have just completely evaporated.
Right, they're just gone.
And when we, as modern people try to picture a collapse of that absolute magnitude, we're really conditioned to expect some sort of epic cinematic showdown.
Oh, totally. Like a blockbuster movie.
Right. We look for the invading armies pouring over the walls, massive external forces, fire raining down, like a catastrophic war that violently dismantled the state.
Because that's how we think power works.
Yeah, but then you read the specific 7th century text, and it drops this incredibly chilling, almost anticlimactic line regarding a destroyed society. It just says, "We sent no army from the sky against them. One blast was enough."
One blast. I mean, it completely strips away all the mythology of destruction.
It really does.
You don't get the cinematic battle sequence. You don't get the legions of angels descending with flaming swords to mete out divine retribution.
No swords, no fire.
Right. The text is basically establishing the absolute definition of the minimal force principle.
Well, let's back up for a second and orient everyone, because the framework we are applying here is entirely unconventional for this kind of source material.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in perspective.
We are diving into a mid-20th century lecture by a thinker named Allama Parvez, and he is analyzing a specific portion of a classical text, Surah Yaseen, specifically verses 28 through 44.
Right.
But the mission for this deep dive is to look at this material through a completely non-theological lens.
Which is key here.
Yeah, we are analyzing Parvez's argument that this text isn't a book of mystical spells or supernatural history, but rather a rational socio-economic blueprint of cause and effect. We are reporting on his views, not taking sides, but just exploring this fascinating structural argument.
And Parvez was a linguistic purist and a rationalist, who lived through the massive upheaval of the 20th century.
Right, he saw empires falling in real time.
Exactly. He was looking at societies collapsing around him and realized that the traditional mythological readings of these ancient texts simply didn't map onto the reality of how human institutions actually function.
They just didn't hold up.
No, they didn't. He argued that human beings have this deep-seated psychological craving for theatrical destruction.
Oh, for sure.
Like when a corrupt empire falls, we want to believe it took a massive supernatural effort to take it down. We want the myth of giant flocks of magical birds dropping stones on armies.
Because it makes us feel important, right?
Exactly. It strokes our ego to think our human structures are so formidable that the universe itself has to strain to break them.
Okay, but I'm putting myself in the shoes of a historian or a sociologist hearing this for the first time, and I have to push back a little on Parvez's interpretation of one blast. Because, a blast still sounds inherently violent and external to me. It sounds like an explosion or a lightning bolt.
Yeah, I can see how it sounds like that in English.
So how does he justify reading a blast as a silent, internal, structural collapse? Isn't he just twisting ancient vocabulary to fit a modern sociological worldview?
That is the exact tension Parvez addresses by going back to the linguistics. So the Arabic word often translated as blast is saha.
Saha, okay.
And it essentially means a single cry, a reverberation, or a unified frequency.
A frequency.
Yeah, think of the physics of resonance. If you have a massive, imposing concrete bridge, you don't need to drop a bomb on it to destroy it.
Oh, like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge?
Exactly, the perfect example. If the wind hits it at the exact resonant frequency of the structure, the internal tension simply exceeds the structural integrity.
It just shakes itself apart.
It shakes itself to pieces. It isn't an army attacking the bridge. It is the natural mathematical consequence of a structural flaw meeting an inevitable physical force.
So the blast is basically just the moment of critical failure.
Right. To put it in Parvez's terms, the universe operates on an absolute system of systemic law. It does not require divine intervention in the form of celestial infantry.
Wow.
The system simply allows a society's own internal rot, its own corrupt economic and social actions, to reach their mathematical conclusion.
Which poses a massive challenge to how you and I understand power today.
Oh, it completely upends it.
Because when human institutions want to project power, what do? We throw parades.
Yeah, military parade.
We roll tanks down the street, we build massive fleets, we use the doctrine of shock and awe. We inherently equate visibility with power.
Right, if you can't see it, it's not powerful.
Exactly. But Parwaz is arguing that this text defines the ultimate power as completely invisible. So I have to ask, if a system of law is truly absolute, why wouldn't it show off? Why rely on silent consequence rather than overwhelming visible force?
Because the need to project visible force is a symptom of insecurity.
Oh,
It is the hallmark of a fragile system. A human dictator needs the military parade because his power is entirely contingent.
it relies on fear.
Yes, it relies on maintaining fear in the populace, and fear requires constant, visible reminders of violence.
Because the moment the dictator stops showing off his tanks, the people might stop being afraid.
Exactly, and the system collapses. But a genuinely absolute system, like the laws of gravity or the socio-economic laws of cause and effect Parwaz outlines, operates without any need for theatricality.
That makes a lot of sense.
Gravity doesn't put on a fireworks display every morning to convince you not to step off a cliff.
Right.
The law simply exists, and the consequence of violating it is automatic.
You violate the law of gravity, you hit the ground, you violate the socioeconomic laws of equity and justice, your society shatters.
Precisely. The destruction comes entirely from human hands and the inevitable decay of a corrupt environment.
So it's self-inflicted.
Completely. When a society institutionalizes injustice, when it hoards wealth at the top while the base starves, it is building a societal bridge with fatal load-bearing flaws.
And then the wind hits it.
Right. The one blast, the Seha, isn't a magical punishment sent from the clouds. It is the historical moment the internal pressure finally snaps the weakened pillars.
The society crushes itself under the weight of its own internal contradictions.
Exactly. The universe didn't send an army because the society's own architecture did the job for it.
That really reframes how we look at every failing state in modern history. You stop looking at the sky for a destroyer and you start blaming external enemies, and you are forced to look directly at your own socioeconomic foundations.
It's a harsh mirror.
It really is. But if the system destroys silently through natural consequences, how does it build?
That's the next logical question.
Right, because a blueprint can't just be about how buildings fall down. And after discussing this silent destruction, the text makes a very abrupt pivot.
It does, yeah.
It shifts immediately from the ashes of a collapsed society to the regeneration of the earth. We get these very vivid agricultural images: dead land being revived by rain, the splitting of grain from seeds, the flourishing of date palms and vineyards.
And historically, commentators have read those agricultural verses as simplistic proof of supernatural intervention.
Like a magic trick.
Right. The traditional reading is, look at the dead dirt. God touches the dirt, and a living plant magically appears out of nothing.
But Parwaz doesn't buy that.
Parwaz rejects that premise entirely. He treats this not as a theological argument for creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, but as empirical evidence of an embedded biological regenerative principle.
Embedded meaning the mechanism for life is already present in the dead material.
Exactly. The soil doesn't magically become alive simply because water hits it. The potential for life, the biological code, the complex DNA inside the seed, all of that was already there.
It was just dormant.
It was waiting for a specific environmental trigger. The system requires a collaboration between external input, which is the rain, and internal potential, which is the seed.
So it's a paired action.
Yes. When those two elements combine, the result is regeneration. The text is pointing out that nature doesn't operate by snapping its fingers to create life. It operates by nurturing dormant potential through a calibrated environment.
I can see how that works perfectly for botany, but Parwaz takes this agricultural observation and applies it directly to human sociology and criminal justice.
He does, and it's radical.
It really is.
Yeah.
Honestly, the way he frames wrongdoers in society based on this seed metaphor is difficult to wrap my head around.
It challenges a lot of modern assumptions.
Because modern society is largely built on a punitive justice system. If someone commits a crime, we isolate them, we punish them, and in many cases, we just write them off as permanently defective.
Which, in Parwaz's view, is the equivalent of looking at a frozen, barren field in the middle of winter and declaring that agriculture is a myth. He argues that the people who disrupt society are not inherently evil monsters who just appeared out of a vacuum.
Okay.
He focuses on a specific term used in the broader textual framework, which is fi qulubihim marad.
And what does that mean?
It translates to having a disease in their hearts. He classifies criminals as psychological cases. They are suffering from complexes. They're the human equivalent of the dead earth.
Let me stop you right there, because I can hear a sociologist or honestly a victim of a crime heavily objecting to this.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
Are we really saying that a violent criminal, someone who has caused immense harm, just needs better water? That feels dangerously close to absolving individuals of personal responsibility by just blaming their environment.
I get that.
Doesn't Parwez's model risk ignoring the reality of sociopathy or genuine malice?
Well, Parwez is not arguing for a system without boundaries or consequences.
Okay, good.
You do not let a sick, contagious person roam free in a hospital, and you do not let a violent individual roam free in society. Isolation is sometimes a necessary triage.
Right, you have to protect people.
But the fundamental philosophy behind why you isolate them changes entirely. If you believe a criminal is inherently evil, your justice system becomes an engine of vengeance.
You lock them up to make them suffer.
Exactly. But if you follow the logic of the dormant seed, you recognize that the core humanity, the potential for contributing to society, is still in there. It's just buried under layers of trauma, toxic environments, or psychological disease.
So the entire goal shifts from punishment to rehabilitation.
Yes. The environment they grew up in may have corrupted them, or they lacked the necessary rein, which Parwez defines as psychological rehabilitation, education, and a reformed socioeconomic baseline.
That changes everything.
The crime is the dead output. You can hate the crime. But the criminal is a human being whose inherent dignity remains intact, just dormant. Society's obligation is not to violently punish the dirt. Its obligation is to water the seed.
Think about the practical implications if we actually applied that to an institution today.
It would be revolutionary.
Take a struggling, marginalized neighborhood where crime is high, infrastructure is crumbling, and the schools are failing.
A very common scenario.
Right. The standard bureaucratic response is often to view that neighborhood as a lost cause. You know, the soil is dead, cut the funding, heavily police the area to contain the damage, and write it off.
And that approach fundamentally violates the regenerative principle we're talking about.
Completely.
If the seed of recovery is already inside the failing economy or the marginalized community, then abandoning it is a massive failure of the broader society's obligations.
You have to change the environmental conditions.
You have to bring the rain. You inject capital, you build restorative justice programs, you alter the socioeconomic inputs so that the dormant potential has the actual physical means to split its seed and grow.
But a seed can't grow without soil, and rain doesn't do anything if it just hits solid concrete.
Right, the conditions have to be right.
There is a necessary mechanism to this regeneration. It requires a specific relationship between different elements, which brings us to the next major concept in the source material, the architecture of opposites.
This is where his systemic view really expands.
The text moves from the rain and the seed to this very sweeping declaration. It says, "Glory to the one who created pairs in everything the earth produces, in humanity itself, and in things they do not yet know."
And when most people encounter the word pairs in ancient texts, they instantly default to biological reproduction.
Male and female.
Right, the birds and the bees. It is a very localized, human-centric way of reading the text. But Parwez argues that this concept of pairing zoj in Arabic goes far beyond biology.
Zoj, okay.
Yes, it is the fundamental structural logic of creation itself.
How so? Because if we are talking about things they do not yet know, that implies a law of physics or structure that applies to everything from the microscopic to the cosmic.
Exactly. Every functioning system in the universe requires tension, balance, and collaboration between opposite or complementary forces to operate.
Oh, like positive and negative charges.
Yes. You cannot have an atom without the tension between positive protons and negative electrons. You cannot have structural integrity in architecture without the balance of compression and tension.
Right, a building would just collapse.
And in socioeconomic terms, you cannot have a functioning economy without the balance between capital and labor, or the balance between individual rights and collective responsibilities.
It's literally the architecture of existence. I mean, a battery doesn't hold a charge if it only has one pole. The energy has to flow between the opposites.
And Parwez takes this universal law of pairs and applies it like a scalpel to modern economics.
Okay, let's hear it.
He points out that when the earth produces wealth, the dates, the grapes, the crops mentioned earlier in the text, that wealth is never the result of a single force.
It's the product of a pair.
It is the strict collaboration between the natural system, which provides the biological potential, the soil and the rain, and human effort, which tills the land, plants the seed, and harvests the yield.
I see exactly where this is going, and it completely disrupts the modern capitalist narrative.
It really does.
Because the prevalent narrative today is, I built my company, I invested the time, I did the labor, therefore the wealth I generated is 100% mine.
And Parwez essentially calls that narrative a mathematical lie,
A lie. Wow.
because human effort is only one half of the pair. The human being did not invent the carbon cycle.
Right.
The human being did not create the laws of thermodynamics, or the biological code of the seed, or the raw materials of the earth. Since both halves of the pair contributed to the creation of the wealth, the human individual cannot claim sole ownership over the final product.
So who owns the other half? I mean, if the natural system owns a share of the wealth, how does that practically manifest in an economy? Nature doesn't have a bank account.
No, it doesn't. Parwez argues that the natural system's share belongs to the broader society, specifically to those whose fundamental needs are not being met by the current economic arrangement.
Oh, wow.
This entirely dismantles the modern concept of charity.
Let's linger on that for a second, because the concept of philanthropy is massively celebrated in our culture.
We put them on pedestals.
We really do. When a billionaire gives away a fraction of their wealth, we put them on magazine covers. It strokes the ego. It frames the wealthy person as a benevolent savior, tossing life rafts to the less fortunate.
And the text explicitly rejects that dynamic.
Completely.
Completely. In Parwez's reading, returning that wealth to the marginalized is not farat, which is a term often used for charity that carries a connotation of the superior giving to the inferior.
So what is it?
It is their recognized hack. It is their fundamental right.
A fundamental right.
Yes, you are not being generous. You are simply returning the system's share back into the balanced paired system.
You're just completing the circuit.
Exactly. If you withhold it, you aren't just being greedy in a moral sense.
Yeah.
You are fundamentally breaking the structural law of the universe.
Because you're taking both halves.
Right. You are trying to hoard both halves of the pair for yourself, which creates a massive, unsustainable imbalance.
I want to trace the causality here, going back to our very first point about the silent destruction of societies. What actually happens to a society that produces massive wealth but completely breaks this architecture of opposites?
It's disastrous.
Say a society figures out how to maximize the human effort side of the equation through technology, but completely destroys the mechanisms of equitable distribution.
The flow of energy stops.
Right.
Think back to your battery analogy.
Right.
If all the energy is artificially locked on one side of the battery, the device dies. In socioeconomic terms, wealth concentrates at the top. The masses at the bottom are deprived of their hack, their right to the natural resources, and the tension between the poles eventually snaps.
The battery explodes, essentially.
The marginalized populations become desperate. The disease in the hearts, crime, corruption, societal breakdown spreads rapidly because the environment has become toxic.
The soil goes bad.
The foundation cracks,
Yeah.
and eventually you get that one blast. The structural integrity fails, and the society collapses silently under its own unequal weight.
The causality is terrifyingly logical.
It is. It's just math.
The collapse isn't an angry god throwing a tantrum. It's the mathematical result of hoarding. And the hoarding is the result of ignoring the paired nature of reality. It's an unbroken chain of cause and effect.
An absolute system.
And this concept of a balanced, perfectly calibrated system leads seamlessly into the next portion of the text. Parwez shifts from the architecture of opposites down here on the dirt to how these forces operate in the cosmos.
The text moves its gaze upward to celestial mechanics.
Right.
It describes the night pulling back from the day. It tracks the moon returning through calculated phases until it resembles an old, withered date stalk.
Mhm.
And it describes the sun running toward its fixed point.
What stands out to me here is the total absence of the supernatural in these descriptions.
Completely absent.
There's no sun god riding a chariot. There are no angels manually turning the gears of the sky.
Parwez isolates a specific word in these verses, muqaddar.
Muqaddar.
Yes. It translates to calculated, measured, or computed. This is a profound cosmological statement.
Yeah. Because it implies math, not magic.
Exactly. The universe does not operate on chaos, and it does not operate on arbitrary daily miracles. God does not wake up every morning and manually push the sun across the sky. The cosmos is a computable, reproducible, consistent machine.
But Parwez isn't just relying on his own linguistic theories here. In his notes, he brings in external research that absolutely blew my mind when I first read it.
Oh, the Buccal research.
Yes. He cites Dr. Maurice Bucaille. And for you listening who might not be familiar with that name, Bucaille was a French physician. She actually served as the family physician to the Saudi king in the 1970s.
Quite a background.
Yeah, and he became obsessed with doing comparative linguistic analyses of ancient scriptural texts against modern scientific discoveries.
And his findings on this specific section are incredible.
Bukai was stunned by the specific Arabic word used in this verse to describe the motion of the planets and the sun, which is yazbahun.
Right. The standard translation for Yasbahun is usually given as swimming or floating.
Which sounds pretty poetic.
It does. But Bukai pointed out that the nuance of the classical Arabic carries a very specific mechanical implication. Yazbahun does not just mean passive movement. It describes motion that is propelled by internal energy.
This is a crucial distinction. Let me see if I can break this down. If I throw a rock across a pond, the rock is moving, but it's moving because of an external force, right? The kinetic energy from my arm.
Yes, that's external propulsion.
But if a person is swimming across that same pond, they are moving through a medium using their own internal self-generated kinetic energy.
Exactly. And for centuries, classical astronomers and philosophers believed the planets were pushed by external forces.
Like the glass spheres.
Right. The Ptolemaic model imagined the planets embedded in giant, literal glass spheres that were being ground against each other by the prime mover.
Or angels carrying the stars.
Yes. The prevailing human assumption was that inanimate objects in the sky required a constant external hand to keep moving.
But Yaspahun implies these massive celestial bodies are moving under their own internal momentum, which is literally the definition of inertia and orbital mechanics.
It is.
A text from the 7th century is describing planetary motion through the vacuum of space driven by internal momentum.
And it gets even more specific than that.
How so?
The text says the sun is running toward its mustakar. For centuries, classical commentators didn't know what to do with that word.
Because mustakor means what?
Many just assumed it meant the west, since from our perspective on Earth, the sun seems to settle in the west every evening. But linguistically, mustakar means a fixed destination, a specific place of settling, or a designated endpoint of a journey.
But the sun doesn't stop. I mean, it just keeps orbiting. So how does Bukai or Parwez reconcile a fixed destination with a continuous orbit?
This is where modern astrophysics intersects with the text in a fascinating way. Bukai points out that in the 18th and 19th centuries, astronomers discovered the solar apex.
The solar apex.
Yes. Our sun is not just sitting stationary while planets spin around it, and it's not just drifting aimlessly. The entire solar system is hurtling through space at roughly 450,000 miles per hour toward a highly specific, calculated vector in the Milky Way galaxy.
Wait, really?
Yes, specifically toward the constellation of Hercules. The sun is traveling toward a mathematically defined coordinate, a mustakar.
Okay, my brain is officially spinning. We have a 7th century text describing orbital mechanics driven by internal inertia, heading toward a precise galactic coordinate, all operating under computable, Muqaddar mathematics.
It's staggering when you really look at it.
It is. But let's ground this back in Parwez's mission. He didn't write this lecture just to point out cool scientific trivia. What is the socio-economic point of highlighting the exactness of the solar apex?
Parwez's point is to hold a mirror up to human governance.
Okay.
He is demonstrating that we live in a universe defined by absolute, measurable, objective order. The stars do not require daily miracles to function.
Gravity doesn't take a day off depending on its mood.
Exactly. The phases of the moon are so perfectly calibrated you can predict eclipses thousands of years in advance.
Which brings me to a really critical question for you. If we live in a cosmology of such flawless, consistent law, how does that fundamentally change what a society should expect from its own institutions?
It sets an entirely new baseline.
Because when I look at human history, we do the exact opposite. We constantly build societies that rely on the whims of individuals.
All the time.
We base economies on the unpredictable moods of a monarch or the chaotic self-interest of unregulated markets or the arbitrary decrees of corrupt politicians.
And that contradiction is the core tragedy Parwez is trying to expose. If the universe itself is governed by objective, computable law, then a healthy human society must also be governed by objective, consistent law.
No exceptions.
Right. When a society is run by personal whim, you get chaos. The people live in a state of perpetual anxiety because the rules change depending on who is in power.
The economy functions like a casino where only the house knows the odds.
Exactly. But a society anchored in immutable principles. Principles like the architecture of opposites, the equitable distribution of wealth, the restorative nurturing of the dormant seed that society becomes stable.
It becomes predictable.
Yes, it becomes a system where the rules apply equally to everyone, just like the law of gravity applies equally to a billionaire and a homeless person.
Parwez is basically arguing that the cosmos is showing us what a perfect system looks like. It is lawful, it is perfectly balanced in tension, and it relies on internal momentum rather than external coercion.
You nailed it.
It feels like we are standing inside a perfectly synchronized, unimaginably massive clockwork universe. The gears are turning flawlessly around us.
And what do we do?
Instead of building a society that meshes with those gears, we are stubbornly throwing human-made wrenches into the machinery and then acting shocked when our hands get crushed in the process.
That analogy perfectly sets up Parwez's ultimate metaphor in the final section of the text.
The synthesis. We've gone on this massive journey.
It's a huge journey.
We started with the silent destruction of corrupt societies, moved down to the dirt to examine the dormant potential in the seed, analyzed the paired balances required for economics, and zoomed out to the computable laws of the solar system.
And now we bring it all together.
Right. The text brings it all the way back down to human engineering. It closes with this incredibly evocative image, a loaded ship carrying the descendants of Adam on a vessel, and other vessels they ride.
And Parwez reads the loaded ship not simply as a historical reference to early seafaring, but as the ultimate metaphor for human civilization itself.
A structure built by human hands, designed to carry human potential and cargo across time and space.
Yes. But here is the critical insight that ties everything together. The ship is built by humans, but it floats on forces it did not create.
Ah, the laws of hydrodynamics.
Yeah.
Archimedes' principle of buoyancy.
Think about the physics of a ship. It is a multi-ton structure made of steel or heavy wood loaded with cargo.
It's incredibly heavy.
By all instinctive logic, a massive piece of steel should sink straight to the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
But it stays afloat because the human engineers who built it designed the hull to perfectly obey the external, uncreated laws of water displacement.
They respected the Muqaddar.
Exactly. They respected the mathematical calculation of the ocean. They designed a shape that displaces a volume of water equal to the weight of the ship.
And as long as the ship's architecture obeys that external law of the ocean, it survives. It rides the waves. It can endure massive storms.
But what happens if the engineers or the captains decide they're smarter than the ocean? What happens if they ignore the law of displacement?
They sink. If they overload one side of the ship with cargo, which, wow, perfectly maps onto the economic hoarding we talked about earlier,
It really does.
where you break the architecture of opposites by putting all the weight on one side, the ship loses its balance, it takes on water, it drowns by its own weight.
And notice the mechanism of destruction here. The ocean did not attack the ship.
No.
The ocean did not get angry and send an army of waves to punish the sailors. The ship simply violated the immutable laws of buoyancy, and the natural consequence was a silent, inevitable collapse.
Full circle.
We have arrived right back at the minimal force principle we started with at the beginning of the hour.
We sent no army from the sky against them. One blast was enough. The ocean didn't have to fight the ship. It just allowed the heavy iron to do exactly what heavy iron does when it loses its balance.
Parwez is arguing that the divine order, the absolute system of the universe, provides the ocean. It provides the immutable laws of economics, the laws of human psychology, the requirements of societal balance, and restorative justice.
And we as humans build the ship.
Yes, we build the governments, the corporations, the legal systems, the cultural institutions.
If our institutions are aligned with those fundamental laws, if our justice system waters the dormant seed of human potential rather than crushing it, if our economy distributes wealth as a systemic right rather than hoarding it at the top,
If our governance operates on consistent law rather than the whim of dictators.
then the ship sails securely. It displaces the water perfectly.
But the moment we build institutions that arrogantly contradict that cosmic logic, we aren't just making a political mistake. We are actively drilling holes in our own hull.
We are declaring war on the socio-economic equivalent of gravity and expecting to win.
You cannot outsmart the ocean.
You really can't. This entire deep dive, this really intensive intellectual journey through Parwez's linguistic and sociological analysis, it all culminates in one inescapable realization.
A profound one.
All of these signs we've discussed, the silent collapse of the bridge, the dormant life waiting in the dead seed, the required tension between paired opposites, the calculated trajectory of the sun, and the physics of the floating ship, they aren't isolated trivia.
No, they're deeply connected.
They are meant to hold an uncompromising mirror up to humanity.
They are designed to provoke critical thought. They demand that we audit our own structures against the baseline of universal law.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a final, lingering question to mull over as you go back to your day. If the universe we live in is this fiercely coherent, this deeply logical, and operates on such perfectly balanced, mathematically computable laws, why do we insist on building civilizations that contradict its basic logic? When you look closely at the institutions around you today, your workplace dynamics, your local governments, the economic systems you participate in, are they carefully designed to float on the laws of balance? Or are they already taking on water?